Every time he entered a place, it was impossible to ignore his presence. With his extravagant personality, his cigar, and a ring worth more than $50,000 on his pinky finger, his radiant smile contrasted with the two prominent scars on his cheek. Despite his overweight, he could move with lethal speed when the situation called for it. And his clothing was no less striking, with his colorful suits, pearl gray hats, and diamond-encrusted pens. He loved people's attention, although he didn't hesitate to get rid of anyone he considered a nuisance. Al Capone has become the worldwide symbol of the Italian Mafia and American corruption in the 1920s and 1930s. His life has even been mythologized over the years, so today we're going to look into the real Al Capone. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the new encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow us on our Instagram account, which you can find below this video. Gabriel and Teresa Capone moved from Sicily, New York in 1894 to a small apartment adjacent to Brooklyn. When they arrived, they already had 2 children, and a third baby was born shortly after. Gabriel, the father of Al Capone, who had not yet been born, was looking for a new life in the United States. And although there were plenty of opportunities, the stigma against Italian immigrants was also growing, as they were accused of causing the crime spiral that New York was experiencing. Despite this, the Capones were a hardworking and law-abiding family. When their 4th son, Alfonso, was born in 1899, the family had already developed a decent, though rough, life centered around the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The new boy, Alfonso Capone, from the age of 10, already showed the toughness and drive that he would maintain in his adult life. From the beginning, he already showed natural leadership. At 14, he formed the Navy Street Gang, dedicated to protecting Italian women from harassment by neighboring Irish groups. By then, Al Capone had already been expelled from school for punching a teacher in the face. Before World War I began, the Capones moved out of the Italian ghetto. Little Al Capone was part of a family that was moving up to the middle class, although further up the hill was where the truly wealthy people lived. An area that seemed out of reach for the Capones, but young Al looked at this place with ambitious eyes. That's where the Rockefellers lived. Why couldn't they live there too, like the Capones? The truth is, by the age of 19, he had already become a local gangster. He already knew how to use a gun and a knife, and he was a burly fighter who could knock any man to the ground. By 1918, on December 30th, he married May Coughlin, who was 2 years older than him, and had given birth to their son Albert 3 weeks earlier. Family life motivated him to seek a straighter and more decent life, so he decided to move out of the neighborhood and away from those bad influences he himself had cultivated. Now settled in Baltimore, Al Capone took a job as an accountant. But as legal and decent as it might have seemed, this job would be of great help to him when years later he would handle millions of dollars illegally. As we know, this quiet life would not be the end of Al Capone. With the sudden death of his father from a heart attack, the family began to look to Al Capone as a guiding figure and financial support. But for that, well, it was necessary. More money than he earned as an accountant in Baltimore. Meanwhile, the local gang from Brooklyn and Manhattan, which Al Capone had retired from, was at a crossroads. 6 months earlier, a tough mobster in Chicago named Big Jim Colosino had been murdered. The leader of the gang that Al Capone had retired from, named Johnny Torrio, was looking to take advantage of this power vacuum and invited Al Capone to be his new right-hand man. Torrio had already spent several years trying to persuade Al Capone, so he offered him a job as a collector to make sure that extortion payments were made in the city. And so, in a short time, Al Capone became the tough guy of Coney Island. It was on one of these nights that Al Capone made some remarks about a lady's backside, angering the brother who was with her, who in an instant slashed Al Capone's face with a bottle opener. Throughout his life, Al Capone would carry 2 notable scars on his face, giving rise to the famous nickname Scarface. Now then, rumors began to circulate that during his stay in Baltimore, Al Capone was involved in a couple of homicides. A prostitute suspected of keeping a pimp's money, and an acquaintance who reneged on a gambling debt he owed. All of this was bringing unnecessary police attention to the gang, So Capone was called to a meeting with Lucky Luciano, a key member of the group. Luciano ordered him to get out of the city and not even bother to pack. He gave him an envelope with $2,000, which would be equivalent to $25,000 today, and told him to go straight to Chicago. It's very important to note that this is the same period when Prohibition began in the United States, known as the Dry Law. From 1920 to 1933, it completely banned the sale of alcoholic beverages in the country. This was a great opportunity for the Mafia in general, but especially for Al Capone, who years later would become one of the main liquor smugglers in the country. Going back to 1921, Al Capone arrives in Chicago, willing and ambitious to learn the art of the Mafia game. He left his wife in Brooklyn with clear instructions to follow once he had settled into this new life. The challenge now for Johnny Torrio, the leader of the gang, was for Al Capone to use his fist less and his brain more. He gave him a job as security and waiter at the Fort Ducey's, a building that served as Torrio's main base and had a cafe lounge. On the top floor, there was a brothel, and apparently Al Capone spent a lot of time on that floor where he wasn't exactly working. And would these sexual proclivities give him a lifelong battle with syphilis? This was not a place for the faint of heart. Countless unsolved murders took place there, with Al Capone taking the lead in dispatching those whom Torrio wanted eliminated. In fact, Al Capone did so well that he was made a partner in the organization, earning $100,000 a year. For his part, Torrio taught Al how to maintain a respectable appearance, despite the underworld he was in. During that period, the Chicago authorities emphasized their efforts on investigating organized crime. So Torrio had to spread his business into the suburbs of the city. Because the police and politicians in these areas, far from the metropolis, would be easier to control. In fact, it was this expansion by Torrio beyond Chicago that was key to the development of the empire that Al Capone would later inherit. Torrio had already established operations in the areas of gambling, vice, and prostitution in nearby towns. But with the election of the anti-crime mayor in Chicago, William L. Vine, in 1923, the entire base of operations was moved to the suburban town of Cicero. The plan was to make Cicero an open city where the Mafia could sell liquor and run gambling establishments. Torrio reached an agreement with the authorities to close the brothels in Cicero in exchange for being given free rein in the other two branches of his business. And in less than 6 months, the Mafia had already taken over the city of Cicero. In January of 1924, Torrio was so confident in his position in the Mafia that he went on a trip to his old homeland to settle his mother in Venice. In his absence, Al Capone would be the man in charge. His first task was to make sure that the political authorities with whom they had agreements stayed in their positions. Al Capone didn't hesitate to rely on his two brothers, Ralph and Frank, to manipulate the ballots on Election Day, as well as to intimidate voters and the officials in charge of the process with weapons. The police, the sheriff, and even the state prosecutor in the end simply followed whatever Al Capone did. But there was an attempt to stop this by infiltrating 70 plainclothes police officers who found Frank Capone and ended his life by filling his body with bullets. When Al Capone found out about this, well, the diplomacy and delicacy that Torrio had taught him was left completely behind, and Al Capone swore revenge for his brother. No matter how much persuasion Torrio tried to calm him down, Al Capone's wild nature was unstoppable. His inherent violence would result in much blood being shed in the years to come. On May 8, 1924, Al would have the opportunity to vent his emotions over the death of his brother. A partner in a prostitution ring was mistreated by an Irish thug for denying him a loan. Capone found this Irishman and asked him what was going on, and he responded with insults. Capone pulled out his gun and shot the Irishman in the face in front of dozens of diners. Al Capone was never convicted in court for this murder, but the press certainly did. This was the beginning of his public persona and his process of becoming famous as a mobster. Less than a year later, in 1925, Torrio was ambushed by members of a rival gang. He barely managed to survive, but right after that, he had to serve 9 months in prison, accused of running an illegal alcohol factory. While in prison, Torrio made the decision to hand over his mafia operations to Al Capone and disappeared from the face of the earth. In this way, Al Capone inherited a gold mine that was sustained by a highly organized operation. And now, according to his vision of expanding Capone's outlook, it was in the northern part of Chicago. But to make his way, he would first have to subdue the deadliest gang Chicago had ever known, the Ienna Mafia. They operated openly, even having police protection. The Iennas had been major alcohol suppliers for Torrio and Al Capone's businesses. In fact, Al Capone once supported them in their fights against rival gangs. But after finishing off one of those rival gangs, called the O'Banians, the Iennas also decided to take over Al Capone's empire. So they entrusted 2 Sicilians to end Al's life. However, recognizing Capone's power and fearing that their plan might go wrong, the 2 Sicilians informed Al Capone of the Ienna family's plans. Al Capone convinced them to turn in the Iennas, and in a short time they had already killed 3 of the Lena brothers. And in this way, the other 3 remaining brothers fled to Sicily. With the Lena Mafia out of the picture, Capone now only had to deal with the survivors of the O'Banian gang, who had already raided Capone's headquarters a couple of times. In the midst of this conflict, the O'Banians attempted an additional attack on the headquarters where Capone's Mafia operated, with more than 1,000 rounds of gunfire. But miraculously, neither Al Capone nor anyone else died. Al was convinced that the mastermind behind this attempt was Jaime Weiss, the leader of Los Bañón, so he immediately ordered that they find him and take him out completely. A week later, after waiting outside one of Weiss's flower shops without any results, they managed to find him and ended his life along with 3 of his bodyguards. As Weiss's successor was Vox Moran, who was now more eager than ever to get rid of Al Capone. Moran was bold, but not very smart. He even publicly accused Capone of selling bad alcohol. Moran's troops launched several raids against Al Capone's businesses. By February of 1929, Capone was already willing to take whatever actions were necessary, so he ordered a massive attack for Valentine's Day against Moran and his gang. Disguised as police officers, Capone's crews entered Moran's warehouse and captured 7 gangsters who were off guard. They lined them up against the wall while aiming their rifles, until finally none of them escaped the bursts of gunfire. This was later called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre for Moran, even though he wasn't among them. This attack was enough to make him flee the city. Having already eliminated all opposition in the north of Chicago, Capone now focused on the south. After a few murders, his rivals asked for peace, agreeing to hand over a significant part of their mafia operations to him. By March of 1929, Al Capone was already the undisputed boss of Chicago, being portrayed by the press as the supreme gangster. However, he still had many rivals. For years, the leaders of organized crime would meet annually to discuss matters of mutual interest. And the big new topic was what to do about Al Capone. A mobster who made much more noise than the others, generated a lot of press and attracted unwanted attention from all over the country. The mobsters' meeting agreed that Joseph Elio, an old rival of Al Capone, would be placed in Chicago, to keep him under surveillance and, above all, to keep him in check. They also decided that his gambling-related operations would be handed over to this Congress or this commission of mobsters. Capone knew that the best thing for his survival at that moment was to obey and keep a low profile. And what better way to keep a low profile than inside a cell? Well, 16 hours after leaving this meeting of the Mob Commission, Capone was arrested for carrying an undeclared weapon. Capone entrusted his $50,000 diamond ring to his lawyer so he could give it to his brother, who would be in charge of operations, until his return. When he gets out of jail in March of 1930, Capone discovers that the climate had changed considerably, and not in his favor. The FBI had declared him public enemy number 1, considered by the national government as a threat to society. It was clear that Capone was one of the biggest alcohol suppliers during Prohibition, but they had no way to prove it. Not even the acclaimed Eliot Ness and his untouchables from the FBI were able to stop him. Eventually, they became convinced that the best way to lock up Al Capone was actually to convict him for tax evasion. This kind of accusation at that time could turn the law-abiding American public against him. And his old methods for rigging the outcomes of court trials were no longer having any effect. Al Capone managed to bribe several members of the jury, but by the day of the verdict, the judge had managed to change the makeup of the jury panel, those who later had to be protected from the reach of Al Capone's organization. A case was presented that showed Al Capone's lavish spending while virtually paying no taxes. The prosecution concluded by reminding the jury that Capone was no Robin Hood. So he was found guilty by the jury for 3 counts of tax evasion. And on October 24, 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, the harshest sentence ever handed down for mere tax evasion. He thought his Mafia partners would come to help him, but that wasn't the case. They left him there, forgotten, with no one coming out for him. Beyond his advanced syphilis, Capone had been sidelined at Mafia boss meetings because of his loud actions. So finally, for them, now Al Capone was condemned to prison, and that took a problem off their hands. Capone had been excommunicated from the Mafia. He spent most of the time in a prison in Atlanta and the last 3 years in Alcatraz. Syphilis had already destroyed much of his mental faculties when he finally died of a heart attack on January 25, 1947, and from this way, the life of Al Capone, the greatest symbol of the Mafia lifestyle, comes to an end, a figure who still sparks the curiosity of people all over the world today. Thank you. Thank you all very much for watching this video. If you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions, like this and all the other videos, and hit the bell so you get notifications of all our posts. And of course, follow us on our Instagram account, where we post additional material to everything we do on this channel. See you in the next episode, and take care.